The vanished daughter. The discovery. The autumn rain drummed against the Victorian windows of the Blackwood estate as Margaret Blackwood Hayes sorted through her grandmother's belongings. The old mansion, perched on the cliffs of Cornwall, had been in the family for generations, its rooms filled with memories and secrets that seemed to whisper from every shadowed corner. Margaret had inherited the estate 6 months ago when her grandmother Eleanor Blackwood passed away at the remarkable age of 97. Now, at 35, she found herself the reluctant keeper of family history, tasked with deciding what to preserve and what to preserve and what to let go. The attic was a treasure trove of Victorian memorabilia, steamer trunks filled with silk dresses, boxes of correspondence, and photograph albums, documenting decades of Blackwood family life. Margaret had been working methodically through each container, creating piles for donation, preservation, and disposal. It was in the third trunk that she found a postcard. The image showed a bustling street scene from Brighton. The sepia-toned photograph captured the essence of Edwardian England. Ladies in elaborate hats, strolling along the promenade, gentlemen in top hats, and children playing near the pier. But it wasn't the main subject of the postcard that caught Margaret's attention. In the background, partially obscured by a lamppost, but clearly visible, stood a young woman in a dark traveling dress. Her face was turned slightly toward the camera, and despite the distance and the quality of the photograph, Margaret could see that she was smiling. There was something familiar about that smile, something that made Margaret's heart skip a beat. She turned the postcard over. The message was brief, written in faded ink. Having a wonderful time in Brighton. The sailor is doing me good. Will write more soon. Abe. The postcard was addressed to Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood, Ravens Hollow Estate, Cornwall. Margaret frowned. Abe. Those initials meant nothing to her, but the fact that the postcard had been sent to her grandmother suggested some family connection. She studied the woman in the background more carefully, using a magnifying glass she'd found among her grandmother's things. The woman appeared to be in her early 20s, with dark hair arranged in the Gibson girl style popular at the time. Her posture was confident, her smile genuine. But what Margaret most was the resemblance she bore to the family. There was something about the shape of her face, the set of her shoulders, that seemed distinctly Blackwood. Margaret set the postcard aside and continued her search through the trunk. Near the bottom, she found a leather-bound family Bible with a genealogy section filled out in various hands over the decades. She traced her finger down the family tree, looking for any mention of someone with the initials there in her great-great-grandfather's generation. She found an entry that made her pause. Adelaide Blackwood, born 18. Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October weather. She gathered the postcard and the Bible and hurried downstairs to the library, where portraits of Blackwood ancestors lined the walls in heavy gilt frames. She found Adelaide's portrait hanging between those of her parents. The painting showed a young woman of perhaps 18, with the same dark hair and confident bearing as the woman in the postcard. The resemblance was unmistakable. Margaret sank into one of the leather armchairs that had belonged to her great-grandfather and stared at the postcard. If Adelaide Blackwood had died in 1902, how could she have sent a postcard from Brighton and why was she smiling in what appeared to be a Candy Street photograph? The family had always spoken of Adelaide as a tragic figure. According to the stories Margaret had heard, Adelaide had been the youngest daughter of the family, spirited and independent to a fault. She had supposedly died in a riding accident in 1900, thrown from her horse during a storm. Her death had devastated the family, particularly her mother, who had never fully recovered from the loss. But the evidence before Margaret suggested a very different story. Have you ever wondered what secrets your own family history might be hiding? Sometimes the most shocking discoveries are found in the most unexpected places. Margaret spent the rest of the evening researching what she could find about Adelaide Blackwood. The family records were frustratingly sparse. There was a birth certificate, dated March. There was a death certificate, dated November. Margaret, examined the postcard again, under a stronger light. The woman in the background was definitely the same person as in the portrait. The facial features, the bearing, even the way she held her head, it was unmistakably Adelaide Blackwood. But if Adelaide hadn't died in Minchimadian to the others, what had really happened to her? Why had the family believed she was dead? And why had she apparently been living under a different identity in Brighton 4 years later? As the grandfather clock in the hallway chimed at midnight, Margaret realized she was holding more than just a postcard. She was holding the key to a family mystery that had been buried for over a century. The next morning, she would begin her search for the truth about Adelaide Blackwood. But already, she suspected that the story she uncovered would challenge everything she thought she knew about her family's past. The morning brought crisp autumn air and the determination to uncover the truth. Margaret had barely slept, her mind racing with questions about Adelaide and the mysterious postcard. She decided her first step should be to contact her elderly cousin, James Blackwood, who lived in London and served as the unofficial family historian. James was her grandmother's nephew, now in his 80s, and possessed what seemed to be an encyclopedic knowledge of Blackwood family lore. If anyone would know the real story behind Adelaide's supposed death, it would be him. Margaret continued from the library, the postcard spread before her on the mahogany desk. James, it's Margaret. I'm going through grandmother's things, and I found something rather puzzling. Ah, Margaret, my dear. I wonder when you'd start uncovering the family skeletons. What have you found? His casual reference to family skeletons made Margaret's pulse quicken. It's about Adelaide Blackwood. I found a postcard that appears to show her alive in 1996, 4 years after she supposedly died. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When James spoke again, his voice was carefully measured. I think perhaps we should meet in person to discuss this. Are you free to come to London? James, do you know something about Adelaide? Another pause. Let's just say that Adelaide's story is more complicated than the family has traditionally acknowledged. Can you come tomorrow? Margaret agreed to take the train to London the next day. She spent the remainder of the day searching through more of her grandmother's belongings, looking for any other clues about Adelaide's fate. In a small jewelry box, she found a locket that she'd never seen her grandmother wear. Inside was a miniature photograph of Adelaide, and on the back, an inscription, "For my dearest Eleanor, remember me always." Ah. The inscription suggested a close relationship between Adelaide and Margaret's grandmother. But Eleanor had never mentioned having a particularly close relationship with her Aunt Adelaide. In fact, she'd rarely spoken of Adelaide at all. Margaret also found a bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. The letters were addressed to Eleanor, but the return address was simply written. The postmarks ranges from Nientosen. I wish I could see you, but you understand why that's impossible. Please know that I am safe and well, and that leaving was the only choice I had. I have found work here in Brighton, and I am making a new life for myself. It's not the life I had planned, but it is mine, and I am content. Give my love to your mother, though I know she cannot acknowledge it. Your loving aunt, Adelaide. Margaret's hands shook as she read. Adelaide hadn't died in She had left, or been forced to leave, and had been living in Brighton under an assumed identity. But why? The train journey to London the next day seemed to take forever. Margaret clutched her handbag, which contained the postcard, the letters, and photocopies of the family records. She stared out at the country sea rushing past, her mind churning with possibility. James met her at his flat in Bloomsbury, a cluttered but comfortable space, filled with books and family photographs. He was a tall, distinguished man with white hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. He embraced Margaret warmly before leading her to his sitting room. "Now then," he said, settling into his favorite armchair, "show me what you found." Margaret spread the evidence on the coffee table between them. James examined each item carefully, his expression growing more serious with each revelation. "You wonder if these would ever surface," he said finally. "You knew about this?" James nodded slowly. I knew Adelaide hadn't died and my father told me the truth when I turned 21. It was considered a family secret that needed to be kept. But why? What happened? James was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with a decision. Finally, he spoke. Adelaide fell in love with someone the family considered unsuitable. When she refused to give him up, there was a terrible row. The family gave her an ultimatum: end the relationship or leave forever. And she chose to leave? She chose love, James said simply. But the family couldn't bear the scandal of having a daughter who had defied them so publicly. So they created the fiction of her death. It was easier to mourn a dead daughter than to acknowledge a living one who had brought shame upon the family name. Margaret felt a surge of anger. They let everyone believe she was dead. They held a funeral? Oh yes, there was a funeral. A closed casket, of course. They said the riding accident had been too severe. The whole county came to pay their respects to the tragic young Adelaide Blackwood. And she knew about this? Eventually, she had friends who wrote to her, telling her about her own funeral. Imagine receiving news of your own death while you're very much alive. Margaret thought of the letters she'd found. She stayed in touch with my grandmother. Eleanor was just a child when Adelaide left, but she had adored her aunt. Adelaide couldn't bear to cut all ties with the family, so she maintained a secret correspondence with Eleanor. Your grandmother kept Adelaide's secret her entire life. Who was he? Margaret asked. The man, Adelaide? James smiled sadly. His name was Thomas Morrison. He was a doctor, actually quite respectable by today's standard. But he was from a working-class family, and worse yet, he was Irish Catholic. In Minnesota, though, that was enough to make him completely unacceptable to the Blackwood family. What happened to them? They married eventually, lived quietly in Brighton for many years. Thomas established a practice there, treating the poor mostly. They were quite happy, from what I understand. Margaret felt tears welling in her eyes. She gave up everything for love, and the family gave up a daughter for pride, James replied. It's a tragedy all around. Armed with new information, Margaret decided to travel to Brighton to see if she could find any traces of Adelaide's life there. James had given her what few details he knew. Adelaide had lived under the name Miss Thomas Morrison, and her husband had run a medical practice somewhere in the older part of the city. The train to Brighton took her along the same route that Adelaide would have traveled over a century ago. Margaret found herself wondering what her great-great-aunt had felt on that journey. Excitement, fear, heartbreak, or perhaps all three. Brighton in the early 21st century was a vibrant seaside city, but traces of its Edwardian past remained. Margaret checked into a hotel near the seafront and began her investigation at the local historical society. The Brighton Historical Society was housed in a converted Victorian mansion, its rooms filled with photographs, documents, and artifacts from the city's past. Margaret explained her quest to the volunteer coordinator, an enthusiastic woman named Mrs. Patricia Henley. Morrison, you said? And the time period was early 90s on? Mrs. Henley consulted a car catalog. We do have some records of medical practitioners from that era. Let me see what I can find. After an hour of searching through dusty files, Mrs. Henley emerged with a folder. Here we are, Dr. Thomas Morrison. Established practice in 1900 on Church Street. The records show he specialized in treating the poor and working classes. Quite unusual for the time. Most doctors preferred wealthier patients. Is there any mention of his wife? Mrs. Henley scanned his documents. Yes, here's something interesting. There's a newspaper clipping from 90s about a charity event. It mentions Mrs. Adelaide Morrison, wife of Thomas Morrison, who organized a fundraising deal for the Brighton orphanage. There's even a photograph. Margaret's heart raced as Mrs. Henley produced a yellowed newspaper clipping. The photograph showed a group of well-dressed ladies standing around a tea table. In the center, clearly identified in the caption, was Adelaide Morrison. It was definitely Adelaide Blackwood. Older than in the family portrait, but unmistakably the same woman. She was smiling, looking confident and happy. This was not a woman living in exile and misery, but someone who had found her place in the world. "Are there any other records?" Margaret asked. "Let me check our address directories." Mrs. Henley pulled out several large volumes. "Here we are." The Morrison family lived at 47 Church Street. After that, there's no further record of them in Brighton. Margaret spent the rest of the day exploring Church Street. Number 47 was now a modern office building, but a brass plaque near the entrance indicated that it had been the site of a medical practice in the early 19th century. According to the records, she had lived in Brighton for at least 17 years. She had been involved in charity work, had been part of the community. This was no tragic exile. This was a woman who had built a new life for herself. That evening, Margaret visited the local cemetery, hoping to find some trace of Adelaide and Thomas. In the older section, among weathered Victorian headstones, she found what she was looking for. The grave was simple but well-maintained. The headstone read, "Thomas Morrison, beloved husband and physician, 178. Here lay her great-great-aunt, a woman who had been mourned as dead in 1928, but had actually lived for another 23 years. Adelaide had outlived her supposed death by more than 2 decades. What would you do if you discovered that everything you'd been told about a family member was a lie? Sometimes the truth is more beautiful than the fiction we've been fed." But the headstone raised new questions. If Adelaide had died in 1925, who had been writing to Eleanor after that date? Margaret remembered seeing letters postmarked as late as. She returned to the Historical Society the next morning with this new puzzle. Mrs. Henley was intrigued by the mystery and offered to help research further. "Let me check our birth records," she suggested. "If the Morrisons had children, there might be records here." After another morning of searching, they found what they were looking for. Thomas and Adelaide Morrison had had 2 children, a daughter named Eleanor Morrison, born in 1900, and their son, named the same, Morrison, born in 1900, named the same. Eleanor, Margaret whispered. "She named his daughter after my grandmother. And look at this," Mrs. Henley said, pointing to another document. Eleanor Morrison married a man named William Hardwell in 1925, just a few months after her mother's death. The marriage certificate lists her address as 14. Margaret felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. Adelaide's daughter, Eleanor, had continued the correspondence with her mother's family after Adelaide's death. That explained the letters postmarked after Henley. Margaret said slowly, "Is there any chance that Eleanor Morrison Hardwell might still be alive?" Mrs. Henley raised her eyebrows. "Well, if she was born in 1904, she'd be over 100 years old now. But it's possible. Let me check our more recent records." The search took most of the afternoon, but eventually Mrs. Henley found what they were looking for. Eleanor Hardwell had died in 1995, but she had had children and grandchildren. One of her granddaughters, Sarah Hardwell, still lived in Brighton. Margaret's hands trembled as she wrote down Sarah's contact information. She was about to connect with living relatives she had never known existed, descendants of the aunt who had supposedly died over a century ago. Sarah Hardwell lived in a charming terraced house, not far from where her great-grandmother, Adelaide, had once lived. When Margaret called to explain who she was and why she wanted to meet, Sarah's response was immediate and enthusiastic. "Oh my goodness, you're from the Blackwood family. Grandmother Eleanor always said that someday someone from the family would come looking for the truth. Please, you must come for tea tomorrow." Margaret arrived at Sarah's house the next afternoon, nervous but excited. Sarah was a woman in her 50s, with graying hair and kind eyes that reminded Margaret strongly of the family portraits back at Ravens Hollow. Come in, Sarah said warmly. "I've been looking forward to this all night. I have so much to show you." Sarah's sitting room was filled with photographs, and documents that told the story of Adelaide's life in Brighton. There were pictures of Adelaide and Thomas at various social events, photographs of their children, and even some family portraits that showed Adelaide aging gracefully through the years. Grandmother Eleanor told me all about the family in Cornwall, Sarah explained as she served tea. She said that Adelaide's family had disowned her for marrying beneath her station, but that one little girl, also named Eleanor, had kept in touch through letters. That was my grandmother, Margaret said. She never told anyone about the correspondence. Adelaide treasured those letters, Sarah said. When she was dying, she made my grandmother promise to continue writing to Eleanor Blackwood. She said it was important to maintain the connection, even though the rest of the family wanted nothing to do with her. Sarah showed Margaret a box of letters, the other half of the correspondence that Margaret had found at Raven's Hollow. These were letters from Eleanor Blackwood to Adelaide, spanning from 1906 to 9. Your grandmother wrote about her life, her marriage, her children, Sarah explained. She sent photographs too. Look, here's one of your mother as a baby. Margaret found herself looking at a photograph she had never seen before. Her mother as an infant, sent by her grandmother to Adelaide's daughter in Brighton. The connection between the two branches of the family had been maintained for decades, completely unknown to most of the family. What was Adelaide like? Margaret asked. Sarah smiled. From everything my grandmother told me, she was remarkable, strong-willed. Certainly, she'd have to be to leave everything behind for love. But also kind and generous. She threw herself into charity work here in Brighton. She helped establish a clinic for poor children, organized fundraising events, visited the sick. She made a real difference in people's lives. And she was happy? Oh yes, very happy. Grandmother Eleanor always said that Adelaide never regretted her choice. She missed her family, especially in the early years, but she had found her true calling in Brighton. She and Thomas were devoted to each other and to their work. Sarah pulled out a photograph album. These are pictures of Adelaide through the years. You can see how she changed, how she grew into her new life. Margaret studied the photographs with fascination. Here was Adelaide in her 20s, still bearing traces of the sheltered young woman she had been. Here she was in her 30s, confident and purposeful, clearly at home in her role as a doctor's wife and community leader. And here she was in her 40s, graying but still beautiful, surrounded by the children from the orphanage she had helped support. She looked so different from the portrait at Raven's Hollow, Margaret observed. That portrait was painted when she was still living the life her family had planned for her, Sarah said. These photographs show the woman she became when she was free to choose her own path. What happened to her son, James? Uncle James became a teacher. He married and had children, but he moved to Australia in the 1930s. We lost touch with that branch of the family, I'm afraid. Margaret spent the rest of the afternoon learning about Adelaide's life and legacy. She discovered that Adelaide had been instrumental in establishing several charitable organizations in Brighton, some of which still existed today. She had been a pioneer in women's rights, advocating for better working conditions for women and supporting the suffrage movement. She sounds like an extraordinary woman, Margaret said. She was, and she never forgot where she came from. Grandmother Eleanor said that Adelaide always hoped that someday the family would forgive her, that they would understand she had made the right choice. As Margaret prepared to leave, Sarah handed her a small wrapped package. This belonged to Adelaide. Grandmother Eleanor always said it should go back to the Blackwood family someday. Margaret unwrapped the package to find a small silver locket, different from the one she had found among her grandmother's things. Inside was a photograph of the Blackwood family, taken before Adelaide's departure. On the back was an inscription, "My family, always in my heart." She kept this her entire life, Sarah said softly. Even after everything that happened, she never stopped loving them. Margaret felt tears welling in her eyes. Sarah, would you like to visit Raven's Hollow? I think it's time Adelaide came home, in a way. Sarah's face lit up. He would love that. and I have children and grandchildren who would be fascinated to meet their Cornish cousins. As Margaret walked back to her hotel that evening, she realized that her discovery of the postcard had led to something much more significant than solving a family mystery. She had found living relatives, people who carried Adelaide's legacy forward. The family that had tried to erase Adelaide from their history had failed completely. She had simply created a new branch of the family tree, one that had flourished in Brighton for over a century. Back at Raven's Hollow, Margaret found herself seeing the family estate with new eyes. The portrait of Adelaide in the library no longer seemed like a memorial to a tragic young woman who had died too soon. Instead, it felt like a monument to a family's pride and prejudice, a reminder of how fear of scandal had led them to bury their own daughter alive. Margaret had invited Sarah to visit the following week, but first, she wanted to understand more about how the deception had been maintained for so long. She decided to search through more of the family papers, looking for evidence of the conspiracy that had erased Adelaide from the family history. In her grandmother's study, she found a locked drawer in an antique secretary desk. Using a letter opener, she managed to work the old lock open. Inside were documents that her grandmother had clearly kept separate from the rest of the family papers. The first document was a letter dated November 19 Doris, written in her great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great. My daughter Adelaide. As agreed, the death certificate has been prepared and filed with the appropriate authorities. The funeral service will take place on November 10th, with a closed casket as previously arranged. All of Adelaide's personal effects are to be packed and stored in the attic. Her room is to be closed and not used again. Any inquiries about Adelaide are to be referred to the official story of the riding accident. The monthly allowance we discussed is to be sent to the address in Brighton, but there must be no direct communication. This arrangement will continue as long as necessary to maintain the family's reputation. I trust that all parties understand the importance of maintaining absolute discretion in this matter. Yours truly, Charles Blackwood. Margaret stared at the letter in shock. The family hadn't just told people Adelaide was dead. They had actually filed a false death certificate and held a fake funeral. The level of deception was staggering, but the letter also revealed something else. The family had been sending Adelaide money. Despite their public disavowal of her, they had been supporting her financially. It was a small comfort, but it suggested that perhaps some family feeling had remained beneath the surface of their rejection. The next document was even more revealing. It was a letter from the family solicitor, dated 1905. Dear Mr. Blackwood, I write to inform you that Miss Adelaide has married the gentleman in question, Mr. Thomas Morrison. She has requested that the monthly allowance be discontinued, as she no longer wishes to accept money from the family. She has also requested that I convey a message to you. She wishes you to know that she forgives the family for the deception regarding her death, and that she hopes someday you will forgive her for choosing love over duty. She asks only that you allow her to maintain correspondence with young Eleanor, as the child is innocent of any wrongdoing and should not be punished for the sins of her elders. I await your instructions on how to proceed. Your obedient servant, Henry Whitmore. Solicitor Margaret found her great-great-grandfather's response in the next letter. Mr. Whitmore, Adelaide may correspond with Eleanor if she wishes, but the letters must come through you. There is to be no direct contact with the family. Eleanor is not to know the truth about Adelaide's situation until she comes of age. As for forgiveness, that is not a matter for correspondence. Adelaide made her choice, and we have made ours. Blackwood. The correspondence continued for several years, documenting the family's gradual softening toward Adelaide. By 19's death, the letters showed that Charles Blackwood had begun asking the solicitor for news of Adelaide's welfare. While the stain was in Tosquince, there were even suggestions that he might be willing to meet his grandchildren. But then the correspondence abruptly stopped. Margaret found a final letter from the solicitor, dated Dear Mr. Blackwood, I regret to inform you that I have received word of your death from Timonia. As you requested in your final instructions, I'm forwarding this information to Miss Adelaide in Brighton. I have also enclosed the letter you wrote to her before your death, which you asked me to deliver only after you had passed away. Your faithful servant, Henry Widmore. Margaret searched frantically for Charles Blackwood's final letter to Adelaide, but it wasn't among the papers. She wondered if her grandmother had destroyed it, or if it had been lost over the years. Have you ever considered how family secrets can shape generations? The decisions our ancestors made in moments of pride or fear can echo through decades, affecting people who weren't even born when the original choices were made. But she did find something else that shed light on the family's eventual attitude toward Adelaide. It was a letter from her great-grandfather, Charles's son, written to Eleanor in minded, "My dear daughter, I know you have been corresponding with Adelaide in Brighton, and I want you to know that I do not disapprove. Your grandfather's pride cost us a daughter and sister, and I do not wish to repeat his mistakes. Adelaide shows a love over family expectations, and perhaps she was braver than the rest of us. I hope that someday we might find a way to heal the wounds that pride has opened. Please give my regards to Adelaide when you write to her next. Tell her that she is not forgotten and that she will always be a Blackwood, no matter what name she bears. Your loving father, Robert Blackwood." Margaret realized that by the 1920s, the family's attitude toward Adelaide had begun to change. The rigid Victorian values that had led to her exile were giving way to more modern sensibility. But by then, Adelaide had built a new life for herself, and perhaps the opportunity for reconciliation had passed. She found one more significant document, a will, dated mente astentus 30, in which her great-grandfather had left a substantial sum of money to be held in trust for the descendants of Adelaide Blackwood Morson to be distributed at the discretion of the family executor. The money had never been distributed. Margaret realized that Sarah and her family were entitled to an inheritance that had been sitting in trust for nearly a century. As she sat surrounded by the evidence of her family's century-old deception, Margaret felt a deep sadness for all the lost opportunities, all the relationships that had been sacrificed to pride and prejudice. But she also felt a sense of purpose. She had the power to right these old wrongs, to bring Adelaide's story into the light, and to reunite the family that had been divided for so long. Sarah lived at Ravens Hollow on a crisp October morning, accompanied by her teenage daughter, Emma, and her elderly mother, Patricia, Adelaide's granddaughter. Margaret met them at the train station, nervous but excited about this historic reunion. As they drove up the winding road to the estate, Sarah gasped at her first sight of the imposing Victorian mansion. "So this is where Adelaide grew up," she murmured. "It's magnificent, but I can see why she might have felt trapped here." Margaret had spent the week preparing for their visit. She had gathered all the family portraits, documents, and photographs that related to Adelaide's story. She had also contacted James in London, who had agreed to join them for what he called the most important family gathering in over a century. The reunion took place in the library, surrounded by portraits of Blackwood ancestors. Margaret had moved Adelaide's portrait to a place of honor above the fireplace, where it could oversee the proceedings. James arrived first, embracing Sarah warmly. "My dear," he said, "you look remarkably like Adelaide. The family resemblance is unmistakable." Patricia, now in her 70s, studied the family portraits with fascination. "Mother always described these paintings to me," she said. She remembered them from the stories Adelaide told her. Emma's Dexesenan, initially overwhelmed by the grandeur of the estate, gradually became fascinated by the family history. "So Adelaide was my great-great-grandmother?" she asked. "And she really faked her own death?" "The family faked her death," Margaret corrected gently. "Adelaide just went along with it because she had no choice." Margaret prepared a presentation that told Adelaide's complete story, using the documents, photographs, and letters she had discovered. As she spoke, she watched the faces of her newly discovered relatives, seeing their amazement and pride as they learned about their ancestors' remarkable life. Adelaide didn't just survive her exile Margaret concluded. She thrived. She became a leader in her community, a champion for the poor and disadvantaged. She lived a life of purpose and meaning. Sarah wiped tears from her eyes. We always knew she was special, but we never knew the full extent of what she had overcome. James nodded solemnly. The family owes Adelaide a tremendous debt. We allowed pride to blind us to her worth. But there's something else, Margaret said. She explained about the trust fund that had been established for Adelaide's descendants, money that had been sitting untouched for decades. Sarah was stunned. We had no idea. We've been struggling financially for years, and all this time there was money that belonged to us. It belongs to all of Adelaide's descendants, Margaret said, and I intend to make sure it's distributed fairly. But more important than the money was the emotional reconciliation taking place. Patricia shared stories that had been passed down through Adelaide's line, tales of Adelaide's kindness, her strength, her unwavering love for the family that had rejected her. She never spoke bitterly about the Blackwoods. Patricia said, even when she was dying, she told my mother to remember that family was the most important thing in life, and that love was stronger than pride. Emma had been quietly exploring the library during the conversation. Suddenly, she called out from a corner where she had been examining a bookshelf. There's something hidden here. She had discovered a loose panel in the bookshelf that concealed a small compartment. Inside was a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon, letters that Adelaide had written to her family but had never sent. Margaret untied the ribbon with trembling hands and read the first letter aloud. My dearest family, not a day passes that I do not think of you and wonder how you are. I know you believe I have brought shame upon the family name, but I hope that someday you will understand that I chose love over convention because I believe that love was the higher calling. Thomas is a good man, a man who dedicates his life to helping others. Our marriage is built on mutual respect and shared values. I am not the fallen woman you may imagine me to be. I am a woman who has found her true purpose in life. I miss you all terribly, but I do not regret my choice. I only regret that pride has built a wall between us that seems impossible to breach. Your loving daughter and sister, Adelaide. The letters spanned several years and painted a picture of a woman who had never stopped loving her family, even as she built a new life for herself. They were filled with news of her marriage, her work in the community, and her hopes for eventual reconciliation. One letter, dated January 20, was particularly poignant. I have heard through Mr. Whitmore that father is ill. I long to come to him, to make peace before it is too late. But I know that my presence would only cause more pain and scandal. So I send my love through these words that he will never read, and I pray that somehow he knows that I have forgiven him, just as I hope he has forgiven me. By the time Margaret finished reading the letters, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. The depth of Adelaide's love for her family, despite everything that had happened, was overwhelming. She never stopped being a Blackwood, James said quietly. Geography and circumstances couldn't change that. Sarah stood and walked to Adelaide's portrait. I wish she could know that her family finally came looking for her, she said. I wish she could see this reunion. Maybe she can, Margaret said softly. Maybe she's been waiting for this moment for over a century. They spent the rest of the day exploring the estate together, with Margaret showing Sarah and her family the places where Adelaide had grown up. They visited her childhood bedroom, which had been preserved exactly as she had left it in. They walked through the gardens where she had played as a child and the stables where she had learned to ride. In the evening, they held a small ceremony in the family cemetery. Margaret had commissioned a new headstone for the empty grave that had been marked as Adelaide's resting place since Empio. The new stone read, Adelaide Blackwood Morrison, 1822, 1925. Beloved daughter, wife, mother, and friend. She chose love over convention and lived a life of purpose and meaning. As they stood around the symbolic grave, Margaret read one final letter, one that she had written herself. Dear Adelaide, your family has finally come home to you. We know now that you didn't die in You became the woman you were meant to be, free from the constraints that would have limited your spirit. We're sorry it took us so long to find you. We're sorry for the pride and prejudice that drove you away, but we're grateful that you never gave up on love. Love for Thomas, love for your children, and love for the family that failed you. Your legacy lives on in Brighton, in the lives you touched, and the institutions you helped build. Burrito lives on here at Trevens Hollow, in the family that has finally learned to honor your memory properly. Welcome home, Adelaide. Welcome home. 6 months after the reunion, at Trevens Hollow, Margaret stood in the newly renovated Adelaide Morrison Community Centre in Brighton. The building, funded by the trust money that had finally been distributed to Adelaide's descendants, was a fitting tribute to a woman who had dedicated her life to helping others. Sarah had used her portion of the inheritance to establish the centre, which provided educational programs for disadvantaged children and support services for families in need. It was exactly the kind of work that Adelaide had been passionate about during her lifetime. "I think Adelaide would be proud," Sarah said, as they watched children playing in the centre's bright, cheerful playroom. "I know she would be," Margaret replied. "This is her legacy made manifest." The centre's opening had been covered by the local Brighton newspaper, which had run a feature story about Adelaide's remarkable life and the family reunion that had brought her story to light. The article had generated interest from historians and genealogists, and Margaret had been contacted by several other families who suspected they might have similar secrets in their own histories. "Your family story might be more complex and fascinating than you realize. Every family has mysteries waiting to be uncovered, stories that could change how you understand your own identity and heritage." Back at Trevens Hollow, Margaret had made significant changes to honor Adelaide's memory. The library now featured a permanent display about Adelaide's life, including the postcard that had started it all, the letters she had written but never sent, and photographs from her life in Brighton. Margaret had also established an annual scholarship in Adelaide's name, to be awarded to young women who showed the courage to pursue unconventional paths in life. The first recipient was Emma, Sarah's daughter, who had been inspired by her great-great-grandmother's story to pursue a career in social work. The family dynamics had changed as well. The Brighton branch of the family had been fully integrated into the Blackwood family tree. Sarah and their family were regular visitors to Trevens Hollow, and Margaret had made several trips to Brighton to learn more about Adelaide's life and work there. James had undertaken a complete revision of the family history, correcting the records to show Adelaide's true story. The false death certificate had been officially corrected, and Adelaide's real death date and place of burial were now properly recorded. Perhaps most importantly, the family had learned to talk openly about Adelaide's story. No longer was she the tragic aunt who had died young in a riding accident. She was Adelaide the brave, Adelaide the pioneer, Adelaide who had chosen love over convention and had lived to see her choice vindicated. Margaret often found herself standing before Adelaide's portrait in the library, marveling at how much the family's understanding of this woman had changed. The young woman in the painting no longer seemed like a victim of circumstance, but rather like someone who was preparing to embark on a great adventure. The postcard that had started it all was now framed and displayed prominently in the library. Margaret had had it professionally analyzed, and experts had confirmed that the woman in the background was indeed Adelaide Blackwood. But more than that, they had noted something that Margaret had missed in her initial examination. Adelaide wasn't just smiling in the photograph. She was looking directly at the camera, as if she had known that someday someone would be looking for her. One evening, as Margaret sat in the library reading one of Adelaide's letters to her grandmother, she was struck by a particular passage. "I have faith that someday the truth will come to light. Secrets have a way of revealing themselves when the time is right. You may not live to see that day, but I believe that love is stronger than deception, and that family bonds cannot be permanently severed by pride or prejudice." Adelaide had been right. The truth had come to light more than a century later, triggered by a chance discovery in an attic. Her faith in the power of love and family had been vindicated. Margaret had also discovered that Adelaide's story was not unique. Research into the period had revealed that many Victorian families had dealt with inconvenient children by creating elaborate fictions about their deaths or disappearances. Adelaide's case was unusual only in that the truth had eventually been uncovered and the family had been reunited. The experience had changed Margaret's perspective on family history and the stories we tell ourselves about the past. She had learned that official family narratives often concealed more complex truths, and that the most interesting stories were often the ones that had been deliberately hidden. She had also gained a new appreciation for the courage it took to live authentically in an era when social conventions were rigid and unforgiving. Adelaide had paid a high price for her choices, but she had also gained something invaluable, the freedom to be herself. As Margaret prepared for bed that night, she took one last look at Adelaide's portrait. Tomorrow, she would continue the work of preserving and sharing Adelaide's story, ensuring that future generations would know the truth about their remarkable ancestor. But tonight, she simply wanted to acknowledge the woman who had refused to let society dictate her choices, who had built a meaningful life from the ashes of family rejection, and who had never stopped believing that love would ultimately triumph over prejudice. "Thank you, Adelaide," Margaret whispered to the portrait. "Thank you for showing us what courage looks like." The postcard that had revealed Adelaide's secret was now part of a larger story, a story about the power of truth, the importance of family, and the enduring strength of love. Adelaide Blackwood Morrison had been erased from her family's history once, but she would never be forgotten again. Her smile, captured in that chance photograph on a Brighton street in 19th Suisse, had waited more than a century to tell its story. Now finally, the world knew that Adelaide Blackwood had not vanished in none. She had simply transformed herself into someone even more remarkable than the young woman who had left Ravenshollow in search of love and freedom. The next time you look through old family photographs or documents, remember Adelaide's story. What secrets might your own family history be hiding? What truths are waiting to be discovered? Sometimes the most extraordinary stories are hidden in the most ordinary places, waiting for someone with the curiosity and courage to uncover them. In the end, Adelaide's legacy was not just a community center in Brighton or the scholarship in her name. It was the reminder that every family story is more complex than it appears on the surface, and that the courage to seek truth can heal wounds that have festered for generations. The woman who had supposedly vanished in 1900 though had actually lived on in Brighton, in the letters she wrote, in the lives she touched, and in the family that had finally learned to honor her memory. Her story was a testament to the power of love, to transcend time, distance, and even death itself.